All right, let's go ahead and take a look at St. Pete Blues and break it down. So maybe the first thing that you want to do is become accustomed to the changes of a jazz blues, especially in the key of F. That's a horn key. So if you're coming from more of a blues rock background, you're used to playing a 1-4-5 in the key of E. Maybe the first thing to do is just get accustomed to these changes. So you can sit down and look at the changes and just play chord voicings just to feel the changes as they go through. But you'll still feel that circular 12-bar blues form that we all grew up with. So let's break down the first chorus. This is a walking jazz. It's called a walking 4 bass line. And this is a hallmark in all jazz styles of music, swing jazz styles of music, where the bass player kind of sounds like they're walking down the street a little bit, and there's just this forward momentum that's created. And, there's a lot of attention that's paid to connecting the two chords. So right away in the first 4 bars, we approach the next chord, the oncoming chord, either chromatically or with a scale tone approach or with the 5 of that respective chord. So let's just take a look at the first 4 bars and we'll break it down. So we start with right on the root with the F. And you don't always have to start on the root, but it's a good idea to start with the roots because that gives you a context of the chord. So we're going to start on our F with a nice low F. And by the way, as a general rule, you kind of want to keep your bass lines on the bottom 2 strings. That will just kind of give you that, you want that nice fat sound. And we want to try to, approximate the sound of a bass as much as we can. So we're going to start on a low F. Use that nice open string as bass players would do. And we're going to just outline an F triad. Then we're going to go down a half step to approach the B flat chromatically. That gives it kind of a nice blues sound. And we do the same thing at the end of the second measure, approaching the F7 chromatically. Another chromatic approach to C. And then notice in the 4th bar, when you have 2 changes, that one's actually pretty easy because if you were to divide the beats of the measure up, the first 2 beats can just be the root of the chord followed by the approach note, which could be a chromatic approach, could be something else. But a chromatic approach usually sounds really good, meaning a half step above or below the note you're going to. So in the 4th bar, you've got C minor 7, so you'll start right on beat 1 with a C, and then beat 2 will be the chromatic approach to F, which is the chord that appears on beat 3. F now will be the note on beat 3, followed by a chromatic approach on beat 4 to the next B flat 7 chord in the 5th measure. So now we have this nice smooth motion. Okay, so if you have 2 chords to the bar, it's actually pretty easy coming up with notes in your bass line because you basically can outline the root of the chord followed by a chromatic note approaching the next chord. The next root of the chord. Now we go into measure 5, and we're just outlining each of these chords. So a nice way to do that is to just play either the arpeggio of a chord or maybe a little scale fragment such as 1, 2, 3, 5, which is exactly what we do in bar 5. 1, 2, 3, 5 of the B flat. And then we do almost the same thing with the B diminished 7. Because remember, you don't have any chords here, so you have to outline the sound of the chord with just a single note bass line. So we can just do that here. Those are all chord tones of B diminished. And then here's an example in measure 7 where you don't have to play the root of the chord. And the reason why we're not going to go back to an F is because we're creating this nice arc. And that's another thing that you want to kind of go for when you're composing your own bass lines and ultimately improvising your own bass lines through tunes, is that you want to create this nice melodic arc. If you listen to somebody like Ray Brown or Sam Jones, by the way, it's a really good idea to listen to bass players when you listen to recordings. You'll have newfound respect for the bassist in your group, or maybe not. I guess it all depends. But what we're doing now is creating this nice arc that rises melodically from bar 5, 6, and that just continues to go up to the 3rd of F. So that's almost like a little melody, and when I listen to the great jazz bass players, I hear melodies in their bass lines, which is kind of what you want to go for. All right, now let's check out measure 8. we have this nice little effect that I call the pull off to nowhere. And basically what it is you notice on the third beat in your tab there, you've got an eighth note. And the second eighth note is an open string A in parentheses. So it's something that you don't really want to articulate to sound like the note A. It's more of a feel. So if you imagine a drummer, he or she would be playing the ride cymbal to keep that time going, ding, 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 ding. Those little bumps in the road as you kind of walk and give it a nice little swing effect, Drummers also do this on the snare drum. If they're playing the brushes, they'd be like, shh, check, basically dropping in those eighth notes on the end of whatever beat. So bass players do this, and we can do this by with a number of different techniques. And this one is the pull off to nowhere. So the idea is that you start with a D, and then just pull it off, and then you're catching it immediately with your first finger. So it's gonna, in this case, it's gonna spill over into a low F sharp. So it's like a little snap. So if you do that, you can kind of hear the A, but it's more of a feel that we're going for. So you notice I'm now muting out the A string with this part of my index finger, and we don't hear it. So you don't want it to sound like, that's not what we're going for. It's just going to be a real tight snap. Okay, so that whole bar, measure 8, would sound like this. 1, 2, 3, and it just kind of propels it forward a little bit, Imagine if somebody was walking down the street, they've added a little skip in their step. We see the same thing again in measure 11. Another pull off from D to the A. And then finally, at the end of measure 12, we have another kind of like downshift in your gears by anticipating beat 4. So we go. And that kind of tells your ear that something else is coming up next, We're ready for something new. And that's exactly what we get in measure 13. We kick off our second chorus with some double stops in tenths, which is a nice way to kind of fill out the sound of the chord without playing a full-bodied chord. And this is actually a nice little cliche. It's used in a lot of songs. Blue Monk comes to mind, things like that. But that leads us right into the B flat and home to the third measure of F7. So now we're going to invite the fingers of the right hand to the party, and we're going to start integrating some of these lines and chords. And these are the exact same rhythms that we worked through in the primer. So most of these are on the beat, together with the bass line, just quarter notes. But then we have another little syncopation here, just to break things up a little bit on the and of beat 1 in the second measure. We have this, just to give it a little bit of a variety, and then slide up into this next note, just to give it a little bit of a vibe. Then we start using our syncopated staccato chord jabs that we covered in the primer. So we're just descending. And again, those are called chord jabs because they're like little short staccato figures. And how you achieve that is through the fingers of your left hand or your fretting hand. So basically, if you just have a chord, just pop those fingers off the fretboard. You don't have to, go to the point where you're actually, pulling off and making notes, making the sound of notes ring, but rather just releasing the fingers as short as possible, while the finger that's holding down the bass note stays down. So looking at measure 4 of the second chorus, the C minor 7 into the F7 into the following bar of B flat 7, those are all real tight chord jabs with a nice flowing, smooth bass line underneath. So we have this. So that's kind of the feel that you want to create. And it also creates the sound or the illusion of two different players. You've got this nice flowing bass line, and then you've got these real tight chord pops on top, as if there were two players actually playing. So the next few bars just basically deal with that, those chord pops. You want to make them all staccato, and they're either going to be on the beat, so meaning to pluck the strings together at the same time with the thumb, or on the and of a particular beat, and so you'll pluck them right after the thumb. So again, it's a good preparatory exercise to practice building independence between the thumb and the claw of the right hand. And as we move into the last 4 bars of this blues, we're just adding little 3-note voicings, again, on and off the beat. So let's see, in measure 20 in your PDF sheet, we have this. On, off, on, off. So as you practice and work through this, you might want to just take each chord and just isolate it. For example, if you took that C7 sharp 9 chord at the penultimate chord there at the end, just kind of practice, if you have that fingering, practice releasing the chord part of it. So that means fingers 1, 3, and 4 while you're holding down the middle. And I'm not even coming off the strings with my fingers, I'm just releasing the pressure. As opposed to this sound. Sometimes when people play this style, it doesn't really swing because they don't really get that separation of parts that's through articulation, which really kind of comes down to the left hand. So if we were looking at measure 21, the way to not play it would be this. That doesn't sound like it's swinging at all. It's hard to do it, actually. But if you pop each of those chords, both on and off the beat, then you get more of this sound from measure 21, the last 4 bars. Now it sounds much more like a rhythm section, like a drummer and a bass player just swinging and having a good time with the music.